Welcome back to the Flow Fiesta. We're going to be doing flow variable best practices. Welcome back to the SteveTechArc channel. Today we're diving into the Flow Fiesta even further, and today we're going into flow variables. Now remember, we're looking at this as an architect. So we're going to be looking at variables like we do if we were writing code, how to name them, how to use them. So we're going to be diving in to flow variables and going through best practices. So here we are at the Flow app that we've shown before. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new flow. And we'll start with a flow from scratch. And we'll just create a record triggered flow, which we've discussed in previous videos. And from here, we're not really going to execute it. We're just going to use it illustrative. So we're going to do an object account. Record is created. But here, what we're going to do is we can start adding elements. But when we add elements, we can also come over here and create a new resource. So these resources will be scoped for the flow. And what that means is they will create and be available all throughout the flow. What we're going to be focused on, there are a number of types from variables, constants, formulas, text templates, and the new stage. We're going to focus today on the variable. So a variable is, if you are familiar with code, this is just creating a variable. But if you're not familiar, it could be a temporary holding spot for something that would carry through the life cycle of the flow. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go and call it just test, which you shouldn't be calling. You should always give it a description. And what I want to show you is that you have a number of data types: text, record, number, currency, Boolean, and all the way down to even an apex defined structure. Here is a very important concept. If I say text, then I can allow multiple values. What this is actually doing is creating a list of text, or it could be creating a list of a record or a list of numbers. So this is really powerful. With a simple checkbox, I can have a single element or I can have multiple elements. Now, we're going to go into a little bit about what is available for input and what is available for output. And so there I am, as I have a text, and I'm not going to say allows multiple inputs. And if it's a singular text, then I can set up a default value. So that means that I can say that at the very beginning, before I even interact with this variable, I can give it a value it will hold all the way through to the end unless I were to have it changed. So this is very powerful. So if we look at variables, we can see that they can have text, number, Booleans, date times, records, collections. We also can mark them as multiple variables, and we can mark them for input or output. Now, the input and output is when you're calling the flow, let's say from an outside process, or you're calling one flow to another flow. Now, you want to be careful making this available for input. If you have a number of variables for internal processing in a flow, you should by default keep all of them not available and only carefully select which ones will be available for input and which ones will be available for output. Now, the name of a variable can be very important, and because you're going to be creating names and elements and many other components. So first, be descriptive. Don't use variable 1. Use something like account ID or is opportunity 1. Be careful with abbreviations that are unrecognizable. Now, many architects, developers follow a naming conventions, maybe using camel case, or I've seen in a number of implementations, people put prefixes, var, account name, call, contact. So have the prefixes because your variables might be blended with the elements, and it might be very powerful to know that it's a variable and maybe even the data type. So you'll see The data type might even, DT close date, could really indicate the data type. So think about your naming schemes, naming it potentially with a var, and potentially naming the data type. So if there's multiple different variables available, you can quickly choose and identify the one you're using. You definitely want to avoid, reserved names, and include, maybe you might want to talk about where it came from. You might want, for input parameters, maybe have a prefix input. For export, have export. Keep the names within reasonable length, and definitely be documenting what's inside of it, what's the purpose of the variable. If there's any ambiguity, you want that to be clear. A few more best practices. Don't just create one-off variables if you could reuse them. But if you do reuse them, maybe you want to reset the value at the beginning of, let's say, a branch of your logic. Then think about the data types very carefully. Really think about your data type and making sure that it's using properly. Watch your collections. You do have to worry about something called it's heap size. That's the amount of memory that's being held. And if you create very complicated flows that hold large lists or collections, you can lead to errors. Though when you're doing loops and bulk actions, you do need to have the collections. So that you need them for the collections, for the loops and the processing, but you want to be careful carrying too much in memory. Think about the scope on your input-output parameters, knowing what's being passed in and knowing what's being passed out. Definitely know about your default values. And so if you have default values, that way the variables may not end up with an unknown state, like a null value, which is not having a value. So by default for your scalars, which are your singular values, give them a default value. Think about your collections. They are going to sit there with empty. So you might want an assignment in order to give it a default value at a very specific state in your flow. Make sure you describe them. And again, here I am reiterating line 6, avoid the large collections. Think about your governor limits, memory usage, but then use them properly for Salesforce bulkification. You want to think about that things will go wrong. So, variables can have null values. So unless you assign them, you have to be ready to have them have a null value. And even in the processing of your loop, you might need to handle that. Always have fault paths. Consider the sensitive data, what's you're bringing into memory, especially with the input and output parameters, the consequences of field level security of if the flow is running in the context of user A and they may not versus user B, and they may not have the correct permissions. Think about the assignments for performance, and definitely consider keeping your API calls down, knowing that those will hit against your limits and slow down the processing. So these are some best practices when working with flows. So we're bringing our architect mindset to flow development. So we may start with a flow that has 2 or 3 branches in its flow, but it can quickly grow to tens or more of assignments, and your variables will grow and grow. And when you start to choose things, they're going to be blended in with other elements. So really get a naming standard. Think about the memory. Think about handling them properly with the null values. Go through these best practices and definitely control your input and your outputs. These are best practices. So when you're working with your flows, your variables are going to operate properly and give you the proper security. So this is the mindset you should have when building flows. Join me again in future videos where we'll be diving deeper. Keep your flows smooth and your variables sharp. Join me again, same bat time, same bat channel. Make sure you subscribe to SteveTechArc and have a great day.